She made sacrifices for duty. Her dedication and devotion never wavered.
For decades, the truth stayed buried behind palace walls. At 75, the king can no longer keep it hidden. And what he has finally confirmed could change everything we thought we knew. The weight of a crown and a lifetime of silence. The moment a child is born into the British royal family, their life is no longer entirely their own. That reality is often spoken about in abstract terms, wrapped in the language of duty and privilege. But for King Charles, it was something far more personal, a quiet, constant presence that followed him from childhood into old age. And by the time he reached 75, that presence had become impossible to ignore. Because behind the ceremonies, the titles, and the carefully composed public image, there was always something else, something unspoken, a tension that never fully disappeared, no matter how many decades passed or how many roles he stepped into. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not explode into scandal overnight. Instead, it lingered in the background, shaping decisions, influencing relationships, and quietly defining the course of his life. From the very beginning, Charles was raised under a level of expectation that few could truly understand. As the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II, his future was mapped out before he could even comprehend what it meant. There was no question about who he would become. The only question was how he would carry it, and that distinction would prove to be more important than anyone realized at the time. His upbringing reflected the priorities of the institution he was born into. Discipline, tradition, and resilience were emphasized above all else. Emotion was something to be controlled, not displayed. Personal struggles were to be managed privately, never allowed to interfere with public duty. It was a system designed to produce stability, but in doing so, it often left little room for individuality. Those who observed Charles closely during his younger years often described him as thoughtful and sensitive. He was not indifferent to the world around him. In fact, he seemed to feel it more deeply than many expected. But that sensitivity existed within a framework that did not always accommodate it. And over time, the gap between who he was and who he was expected to be began to widen. That gap did not create immediate crisis. Instead, it created something more subtle, a quiet internal conflict that followed him into adulthood. On the surface, he fulfilled his duties. He attended engagements, represented the crown, and prepared for the role he would one day inherit. But beneath that surface, there were signs that the burden he carried was not entirely visible to the public. Palace insiders, though rarely speaking openly, were aware that Charles was not simply navigating the responsibilities of royal life. He was also navigating something more personal, a truth that could not easily be reconciled with the expectations placed upon him. And because of the nature of the monarchy, that truth could not be addressed in the way it might be for someone outside that world. Instead, it had to be managed. Over the years, this management took many forms. Public appearances were carefully structured. Narratives were shaped to maintain consistency and reassurance. Any sign of uncertainty was quickly softened, reframed, or redirected. The goal was not deception in the traditional sense. It was preservation. The preservation of an image that the monarchy depended on to maintain its authority and stability. But the longer something is managed without being fully confronted, the more deeply it embeds itself. And in Charles's case, that meant carrying a weight that grew heavier with time. It was not just the weight of the crown, though that alone would have been significant. It was the weight of a life lived within boundaries that did not always allow for complete honesty. As the years passed, Charles became more defined in the public eye. He was seen as a man of intellect, a champion of environmental causes, someone who spoke openly about issues long before they became widely accepted. Yet even as he developed this identity, the underlying tension remained. It surfaced in subtle ways, in moments of visible discomfort, in decisions that seemed to carry deeper implications than what was immediately apparent, in relationships that were shaped as much by obligation as by emotion. To the public, these moments were often interpreted as quirks or complexities of character. But within the palace, they were understood as part of a much larger story. A story that could not easily be told, because to tell it fully would require confronting the very structures that had defined his life. It would mean acknowledging that the system designed to uphold the monarchy had, at times, required personal compromise on a profound level. And that was not something the institution was prepared to do, especially during the earlier decades of Charles's life. So, the silence continued. Not an absolute silence, but a controlled one. Carefully maintained, occasionally adjusted, but never fully broken. It became part of the fabric of royal life, woven into the routines, the protocols, and the public presentations that define the monarchy for generations. And yet, time has a way of changing even the most rigid systems. By the time Charles reached 75, the world around him was no longer the same as the one he had been born into. Expectations had shifted, public attitudes toward transparency had evolved, and the idea that such a long-held truth could remain unaddressed had become increasingly difficult to sustain. What had once been manageable was now pressing to the surface, not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of years. Years of choices, compromises, and quiet endurance. Years of carrying a truth that existed just beneath the surface of everything he did. And as that truth began to emerge, it became clear that the story of King Charles was not just about duty or tradition. It was about the cost of silence, a cost that had been building for a lifetime. The secret that followed him since youth. If the weight of the crown defined King Charles's public life, then the secret he carried defined something far more personal. It was not something that appeared suddenly in adulthood or emerged during moments of crisis. It began much earlier, taking shape during his youth, when the expectations of the monarchy first collided with the reality of who he was becoming. As a young prince, Charles was already set apart, not just by his position, but by his temperament. Those who encountered him during his early years often noticed a certain introspection. He was observant, thoughtful, and at times unusually aware of the pressures surrounding him. While other children experienced freedom in forming their identities, Charles's path was already being guided with precision. His time at Gordonstoun is often referenced as a defining period. The school, known for its strict discipline and emphasis on resilience, was chosen in part to strengthen his character. But for Charles, it also became an environment where his differences were more visible. He was not naturally suited to the harshness of that system, and the experience left a lasting impression. It was during these formative years that the first signs of inner conflict began to emerge, not in dramatic displays, but in quieter ways, moments of withdrawal. Letters that hinted at loneliness, a sense that he was constantly trying to align himself with expectations that did not fully match his instincts. And yet, there was little space to explore that conflict openly. Within the royal framework, uncertainty was not something to be indulged, it was something to be corrected. Advisors, tutors, and senior figures around him all played a role in shaping his development. Their focus was clear. He needed to become the future king, not a version of himself that might complicate that role. But identity is not something that can be entirely reshaped by instruction. As Charles grew older, the gap between his inner world and his public responsibilities became more pronounced. During his early adulthood, this gap began to intersect with relationships, choices, and the direction of his personal life. It was no longer just an internal struggle. It was becoming something that influenced how he connected with others and how he navigated the expectations placed upon him. This is where the secret begins to take clearer form. It was not a single revelation or a hidden event waiting to be exposed. It was a sustained tension between authenticity and obligation, a reality that those closest to him could sense, even if it was never fully articulated. Friends and confidants describe moments when Charles seemed deeply torn. He understood what was required of him. He accepted the responsibilities that came with his position. But there were also indications that these responsibilities came at a personal cost. That cost was not something the monarchy could easily accommodate. By its very nature, the institution depended on continuity and predictability. The future king needed to represent stability. Any perception of internal conflict had to be managed carefully, not only for his own sake, but for the sake of the entire royal structure. As a result, the approach taken was one of quiet containment. Public appearances were designed to reinforce confidence. His image was shaped to align with the expectations of tradition. Even his personal milestones were guided by considerations that extended far beyond individual preference. And yet, despite these efforts, the underlying tension did not disappear. In fact, it seemed to grow more complex with time. As Charles entered his late 20s and early 30s, the pressure to conform to a more defined royal path intensified. This included the expectation of marriage, an event that carried enormous symbolic weight within the monarchy. It was not simply about personal happiness, it was about continuity, legacy, and the public image of the crown. But by this point, the internal conflict that had begun in his youth was already deeply rooted. Choosing a partner was not just a matter of affection. It was entangled with the expectations of the institution and the need to present a certain narrative to the public. And for Charles, this created a situation where personal truth and public duty were increasingly difficult to separate. Those within royal circles understood that this was a delicate balance. Some attempted to guide him toward decisions that would align with tradition. Others recognized the emotional complexity of his position, but had limited ability to influence the broader expectations of the monarchy. In either case, the outcome was the same. The secret remained, not hidden in the sense of being completely unknown, but unspoken in a way that allowed it to persist without direct confrontation. It existed in conversations that never quite reached conclusion, in decisions that seemed to carry unspoken implications, and in a life that was carefully structured to avoid addressing it too directly. Over time, this pattern became part of Charles's identity. He learned to navigate it with a level of discipline that few could maintain. He fulfilled his duties, developed his public persona, and gradually assumed a more prominent role within the royal family. To the outside world, he appeared steady, even predictable, but beneath that steadiness, the same conflict that had emerged in his youth continued to shape his experiences. It influenced how he approached relationships. It affected the way he responded to pressure, and it remained a constant presence, even as the world around him changed. By the time he reached later adulthood, the secret was no longer something that could be separated from his story. It had become an integral part of it, and yet, for decades, it remained unconfirmed. Not denied outright, but never fully acknowledged in a way that would bring clarity. It existed in a space between speculation and reality, sustained by the very system that had first required its silence. What makes this chapter of Charles's life so significant is not just the existence of the secret itself, but the length of time it endured. From his youth into his 70s, it remained a defining element of his journey, a quiet force that influenced decisions at every stage, even when those decisions appeared to be guided by entirely different factors. And as the years passed, the question became increasingly difficult to ignore. How long can something remain unspoken before it demands to be heard? For King Charles, that question would eventually lead to a moment of reckoning. But at this stage in his life, during the years when he was still finding his place, the answer was clear. The secret would stay where it had always been, just beneath the surface. The love story that shook the monarchy. If there is one chapter in King Charles's life where the tension between personal truth and royal duty became impossible to hide, it is his love story. Not because it was unusual in the way ordinary relationships can be complicated, but because it unfolded under the full weight of history, expectation, and relentless public attention. Long before the world saw him as a husband, a father, or a future king, Charles experienced something far simpler and far more powerful, a connection that felt natural, a sense of ease that stood in contrast to the structured environment he had always known. When he met Camilla, there was no need for performance, no need to carefully measure every word or gesture. For perhaps the first time, he could simply be himself. That kind of connection is rare in any life. But within the monarchy, it can become even more complicated, because the institution does not operate on emotion alone. It operates on perception, tradition, and the expectations of millions. And in that framework, personal relationships are never purely personal. They are evaluated, discussed, and often shaped by forces far beyond the individuals involved. From the beginning, those around Charles were aware that his bond with Camilla did not fit neatly into what was expected of a future king. There were concerns about suitability, about public image, about how such a relationship would be received in a society that still held strong views about royal marriage. These concerns were not expressed loudly, but they were deeply influential. And so, as Charles's role within the monarchy became more defined, the pressure to follow a different path grew stronger. It was not presented as a direct rejection of what he felt. Instead, it was framed as a necessity, a responsibility to the crown that required certain choices, even when those choices came at a personal cost. This is where the story begins to shift. Because the decision to step away from a genuine connection does not erase it, it simply pushes it into a different space, one that exists beneath the surface, influencing events in ways that are not always immediately visible. When Charles's marriage to Diana was announced in 1981, the world responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. It was presented as a fairy tale, a union that symbolized hope, renewal, and the continuation of royal tradition. The images were carefully crafted, the narrative was clear, a young, charismatic couple stepping into a shared future. But behind that narrative, the reality was far more complex. Diana entered the marriage with her own expectations, her own vulnerabilities, and her own vision of what life within the monarchy would be. Charles entered it carrying unresolved emotions and a history that had never been fully addressed. And the institution itself placed demands on both of them that would have been challenging under any circumstances. The result was not immediate collapse. In the early years, there were moments that appeared genuine, public appearances that suggested unity, a growing family that reinforced the image of stability. But over time, the cracks became more difficult to conceal. Differences in personality began to surface. The pressures of constant media attention intensified every disagreement, and perhaps most significantly, the presence of Charles's past connection never fully disappeared. It was not always visible, it did not dominate every moment, but it remained, shaping the emotional landscape of the marriage in ways that could not be ignored. For Diana, this created a sense of isolation that would later become widely documented. For Charles, it reinforced the internal conflict that had been building for years. He was fulfilling his duty, maintaining the structure expected of him, yet still connected to something that existed outside of that structure. The monarchy, once again, found itself in a position where reality and image were no longer perfectly aligned. As the years passed, the tension within the marriage became increasingly public. Interviews, leaked conversations, and media coverage began to reveal a version of events that differed sharply from the fairy tale the public had been shown. What had once been managed quietly was now unfolding in full view of the world. This was not just a personal crisis, it was an institutional one, because the stability of the monarchy relies heavily on perception. And when that perception is challenged, the consequences can be far-reaching. Public trust can weaken, questions about authenticity can grow, and the carefully maintained image of continuity can begin to fracture. For Charles, this period represented a turning point. The secret that had followed him since youth was no longer something that could remain entirely beneath the surface. It was now connected to events that were shaping public understanding of the monarchy itself. Every decision he made was viewed through a different lens. Every action carried additional meaning. And yet, even in the midst of this turmoil, the underlying reality did not change. The connection he had once been asked to set aside remained a central part of his life. Over time, the palace began to adjust its approach. What had once been avoided became gradually acknowledged. Appearances shifted, narratives evolved. The process was slow, deliberate, and carefully controlled, but it reflected a recognition that the original strategy of silence was no longer sustainable. By the time Charles and Diana's marriage formally ended, the world had already seen enough to understand that the story was far more complicated than it had first appeared. But understanding does not always bring resolution, because at the heart of it all was still the same fundamental conflict: the struggle between personal truth and public duty. A struggle that had defined Charles's life for decades and that had now played out on a global stage. What makes this love story so significant is not simply the individuals involved, but what it revealed about the monarchy itself. It showed that even within an institution built on tradition and control, human emotion cannot be entirely contained. That decisions made for the sake of stability can carry long-lasting consequences, and that the cost of maintaining a certain image can extend far beyond what is immediately visible. By the end of this chapter, one thing had become clear: the secret was no longer just a private burden. It had become part of the public narrative, and from that moment forward, there was no turning back. The years turned years of denial and public illusion. In the aftermath of the breakdown of his marriage, King Charles entered one of the most carefully managed periods of his life. not because the truth had suddenly disappeared, but because it had become too visible to ignore and too dangerous to fully admit. The monarchy had faced crises before, but this was different. This time, the tension between reality and public image had reached a point where it could no longer be contained quietly behind palace doors. The response was not immediate transparency, it was strategy. Every statement, every appearance, every decision was measured with extraordinary precision. The goal was not to rewrite history, but to reshape how it was understood, to soften the edges of what had already been exposed, while preserving enough of the monarchy's image to maintain public confidence. For Charles, this meant stepping into a role that required even greater control than before. He could not simply react to events as they unfolded. He had to become part of a long-term effort to stabilize the narrative, a narrative that was now being challenged from every direction. The public, no longer satisfied with carefully constructed images, wanted answers. They wanted clarity about what had happened, about who was responsible, and about what it all meant for the future of the royal family. And yet, the monarchy could not afford to provide those answers too quickly or too directly. So, a balance was created. On one side, there were acknowledgments, carefully worded admissions that suggested awareness without offering full disclosure. On the other side, there was continued restraint, details that remained unspoken, explanations that were left incomplete, and a deliberate effort to guide public perception without fully confronting the deeper truth. This approach extended to how Charles himself was presented. His image began to shift gradually. Where once he had been seen primarily through the lens of controversy, efforts were made to highlight other aspects of his character, his work with charities, his long-standing commitment to environmental causes, his intellectual interests and thoughtful public speeches. These elements were not fabricated. They had always been part of who he was, but now they were brought forward with greater emphasis, becoming central to how he was perceived. It was a way of reminding the public that his identity extended beyond the events that had dominated headlines. At the same time, another transformation was taking place. Camilla, once a figure surrounded by skepticism and criticism, began to be reintroduced in a different light. This process was neither quick nor simple. It required patience, consistency, and a willingness to endure ongoing scrutiny. Public appearances were carefully planned. Interactions were measured. The aim was to gradually shift perception without provoking further backlash. And over time, that shift began to take hold. What had once been viewed with resistance started to become more accepted, not universally and not without lingering questions, but enough to suggest that the strategy was working. The narrative was evolving, even if the full truth remained partially obscured. But beneath these changes, the underlying issue remained unresolved, because the problem was never just about how events were perceived. It was about what those events represented. The gap between public illusion and private reality had not disappeared. It had simply been managed more effectively. For Charles, this meant continuing to live within that gap. He fulfilled his duties. He adapted to changing expectations. He worked to rebuild trust in a system that had been shaken. Yet the same internal conflict that had defined earlier chapters of his life was still present. It had not been eliminated by time or by careful public management. It had only been integrated into a new phase of his journey. There were moments during this period when the strain became visible, subtle expressions, occasional remarks that hinted at deeper reflection, a sense that the effort to maintain balance required constant attention. These were not dramatic breaks from the carefully constructed image, but they were enough to suggest that the story was not as settled as it appeared. Observers began to notice that the monarchy itself was changing. The old approach of strict silence and absolute control was becoming harder to sustain in a world driven by rapid communication and constant media scrutiny. Information moved faster, public opinion shifted more quickly, and the expectation of transparency grew stronger with each passing year. This created a new kind of pressure. It was no longer sufficient to manage perception alone. There was an increasing demand for authenticity, for a sense that what was presented publicly aligned more closely with reality. And for a monarchy built on tradition, this represented a significant challenge. Charles found himself at the center of that challenge. As the future king, he was not only responsible for his own image, but for the direction of the institution as a whole. The choices he made during this period would influence how the monarchy adapted to a changing world. and those choices were shaped, in part, by the very secret that had followed him for so long. Because even as the narrative evolved, the core truth had not been fully addressed. It remained present, influencing decisions, shaping relationships, and quietly defining the boundaries of what could be said and what had to remain unspoken. It was a constant reminder that the illusion, no matter how carefully maintained, was still separate from reality. And yet, the illusion persisted, not because it was entirely false, but because it served a purpose. It allowed the monarchy to continue functioning. It provided a sense of continuity in the face of uncertainty. And it gave Charles the space to navigate his role without forcing a confrontation that the institution was not yet ready to face. But as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that this balance could not last forever. The gap between what was known and what was acknowledged was narrowing. The world was changing, expectations were shifting, and the idea that such a long-standing truth could remain partially hidden was becoming harder to sustain. For a time, the strategy of denial and controlled revelation held. But beneath the surface, something was building, a moment when the illusion would no longer be enough. The moment of confirmation that changed everything. There are moments in royal history that arrive without ceremony, no grand announcement, no dramatic turning point that the world can clearly identify in real time. And yet, when they pass, everything feels different. For King Charles, that moment came not with a single declaration, but through something far more revealing, a shift in tone. By the time he reached 75, the years of careful language, measured responses, and controlled narratives had begun to soften. Not completely, but enough for those paying close attention to notice. His words carried a different weight. His reflections felt less guarded. And for the first time, there was a sense that he was no longer speaking solely as a monarch, but as a man looking back on a lifetime of decisions. It happened gradually, in interviews, in speeches, in quiet remarks that might have once passed without deeper meaning. He began to acknowledge the pressures he had lived under, not as abstract ideas, but as lived experience. He spoke about duty, not just as an obligation, but as something that had required sacrifice, personal sacrifice. And within those acknowledgments, something became clear. The choices that had defined his life were never entirely his own. For decades, that reality had been understood, but never directly confirmed. It existed in speculation, in analysis, in the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid. But now, it was being brought into the open, not through confession, but through acceptance. He did not deny the past. He did not attempt to rewrite it. Instead, he framed it as part of a larger truth, that the monarchy, by its very nature, shapes the lives of those within it in ways that are not always visible from the outside. And in doing so, he confirmed what had lingered for years, that the conflict between personal truth and royal duty was not an interpretation, it was a reality. For some, this moment felt understated. There was no single headline that captured it fully. But for others, it was profound, because it marked the first time that the king himself had allowed that reality to be seen without the usual layers of distance and control. It did not erase the past, it did not resolve every question, but it changed the way the story could be told. From that point forward, the secret was no longer something that existed only in speculation. It had been acknowledged, and once something is acknowledged, it can never return to silence. What this means for the future of the monarchy. When a truth that has been carried for decades is finally acknowledged, the impact does not end with the individual. It extends outward, reshaping the institution that helped contain it. For the monarchy, King Charles's quiet confirmation represents more than a personal moment. It signals a shift in how the royal family may need to exist in a world that no longer accepts distance without explanation. For generations, the strength of the monarchy depended on its ability to maintain a sense of mystery. A carefully controlled image that projected stability, continuity, and quiet authority. But that approach was built in a different era, an era where information moved slowly, and public expectation allowed for greater separation between private reality and public presentation. That era is gone. Today, visibility is constant. Narratives are questioned in real time, and the public expects not just tradition, but authenticity. This creates a new kind of challenge for the monarchy, one that cannot be solved through silence or careful redirection alone. Charles's decision to acknowledge the deeper truth of his own experience may be the first clear indication that this shift is being recognized from within, not as a weakness, but as a necessity, because the future of the institution may depend on its ability to adapt without losing its identity. For the next generation, this lesson is critical. Prince William, who stands as the future of the crown, has already shown signs of a more modern approach, a willingness to engage more directly, to present a version of royal life that feels closer to the reality people understand. But the path ahead is not simple. It requires balancing centuries of tradition with the demands of a rapidly changing world. And perhaps most importantly, it requires learning from the past. The cost of maintaining illusion has now been seen more clearly than ever, not just in public perception, but in the personal lives of those within the monarchy. If the institution is to remain relevant, it may need to embrace a different kind of strength, one rooted not only in history, but in honesty. Because in the end, the future of the monarchy will not be defined by how well it preserves its image, but by how truthfully it is willing to evolve.